In my last video, I talked a lot about how to render a hand and what each part of the hand does so that you can really understand what they should look like. But I realized I never actually talked about how to draw the thing. So that's what this video is going to be. You can find the other one here. Please feel free to jump back and forth between the two. Hello there, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, it's nice to meet you. I'm Pippin. And for everyone else, welcome back. As I said before, this video will be an add-on to my previous one, but it will come with its own set of files too. Down in the description, you'll find a link to my Google Drive where you can download all the assets for this video, including the PSD, PNGs of all of the slides I'm working from in case you don't use Krita or something compatible with it, and a special coloring page that you get to use for free. Anyways, while we go through this video, you'll be able to follow along with me on screen or work alongside me while you practice the lesson we have in store. At the end, I've got a little gift coloring page as a thank you for sticking with me. And remember, as always, if you try out this video and you like the results, please tag me when you post them so I can see. I've created a tag for the series as a whole, so please also tag Archer K Paint Along when you post so that we can all find them more easily. And lastly, remember this is a series and I will be posting more of these anatomy and drawing videos in the future. So if there's something specific that you would like to learn how to render, just say so in the comments. And with all of that explanation stuff out of the way, let's get right to it. I will probably be calling back to the other video several times as I covered a lot of the in-depth information there. This video, however, is all about implementation, starting with paying attention to the bones. So, if you watched the other video, you'll know this image already, and what each of these bones actually do. But how do we represent them in a quick sketch or thumbnail? The carpals, or these bones here, will more or less stay together, so we can draw a loose version of that as our first shape. Next, our metacarpals, these bones here, do have more motion to them, but they will still generally only move together, so we can draw the general shape like this and squash or stretch them depending on the motion of the hands. Notice that this bone here is also a metacarpal, but we didn't include it in the last shape. That's because it moves just a little more independently of the other four. We'll draw this shape to represent that bone specifically. Next, we need to include each of the bones that connect to each finger. Notice how I'm drawing the ones that attach to the metacarpals, which are called the proximal phalanges, so that they're kind of stabbing into the metacarpal shape. That's because the connection of that joint happens inside the palm rather than as a part of the finger. And that's how we're going to remind ourselves. On that topic, we're also going to add this line connection from the metacarpal box to the thumb metacarpal bone to remind ourselves that that part is also a part of the palm. And of course, we'll add a box to account for each of the rest of the finger bones. Remember that the thumb only gets 2 boxes off of its metacarpal while the rest of the fingers get 3. We'll also add a box at the base of the hand because it's typically going to be useless to draw a hand that doesn't connect to anything. So let's draw a few examples. First, let's add our carpal shape. Next, our metacarpals. Remember that we're adding the thumb metacarpal separately. Next, we'll add in our phalange bones. Next, we're going to connect our thumb metacarpal to the rest of them. And we're going to add a box at the base of the hand. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's set that aside and go to the next step. Okay, so we've given our sketch a little representation of a skeleton. Yay! But generally, we'll want to draw our hands with muscles and skin on them too. So let's go into that a little bit more. Your muscles and skin will determine how your bones are allowed to bend. In the last video, we discussed how each of these muscles influence those motions, but didn't get into what kind of limitations they can create. These are important to know for drawing them because being wrong on how far a finger can bend will look painful and stress your viewers out, and we don't want that unless that's actually what you're going for. We have significantly fewer muscles pulling back this part of the hand, and as such, hands will really only bend this far back without any help. That's not to say that they won't bend farther if they're leaning against something or being forced back, just that if you're drawing them without getting that help, they probably won't go this far unless they're hurt. Our 4 non-thumb fingers also inform each other's motions thanks to the way the muscles and tendons are connected to each other. This means that when you move one finger in an extreme way, the others are likely to follow unless there's dedicated effort to the contrary. It also means it's hard to bend them past each other without a little bit of help. we also have a muscle dedicated to touching our thumb to each individual finger, which means that while we can do that, the other finger does typically reach to meet the thumb somewhere in the middle. And of course, our hands have to connect to our wrist and work with those muscles, which are really only built to give you this range of motion, up about this far, down about this far, and side to side about this far. Just rotating my own wrist that much made it pop about 100 times, so more intense angles than that are probably not healthy for the average human. Alright, so now that we know how our hands are actually allowed to bend, everyone go shame the creator of that other video that totally left that out, because that was the actual point they were trying to make when they were talking about the muscles. But I digress. Let's move on to how to implement that into these sketches we made with the boxes before. So, with knowing that our skin and muscles will get in the way of the bones, we can give these shapes a little bit more detail. Remember that a majority of the structure of the fingers is in the bones, but the palm and connections of the fingers are primarily shaped by the muscle, so let's throw those shapes onto here as discussed in the other video. Remember that there's a bit more muscle at the base of the palm here, as well as at the connection of the joints between the metacarpals and phalanges, resulting in a bit more shaping here and here. Also, think about how the back of the hand has these bones, but also tendons behind them, leaving some more shaping on the back of the hand than just flat, which you can represent like this. And note that the skin between the metacarpals here and the thumb metacarpal here will have some skin that works like fabric, meaning there will be a decent amount of wrinkles that change based on the angle of the thumb and the rest of the hand. And of course, think about how folds work on the palm and between each joint on the fingers and the wrist. Our shapes should be looking a lot more like a hand at this point, which means it's time to talk about adding details. I discussed a lot of the details of drawing hands while talking about rendering them, but I didn't really describe how to depict them in sketches or line work. So we'll get into that a bit more here. To start, if you spread your fingers, in this case including the thumb, wide enough, you'll see the webbing between them. What I mean by webbing is the extra skin between your fingers that's there specifically to give you a wider range of motion on your fingers. When you spread them, those places stretch and there won't really be anything inside of the skin, making it look more like webbing. Which brings us to the folds in the skin. There will generally be folds between each bend of the fingers, in the webbing between each finger as well as the thumb, in the palm, and on the wrist. Depending on the fat distribution in the hand, you can also see them in the base of the thumb and between the wrist and knuckles on the back of the hand. The wrist itself will have folds like this when bending up, like this one bending down, and like this one bending to each side. The amount of folds will also depend on the fat distribution in each place, as well as the age of the skin. For instance, the older the skin is, the thinner it gets, meaning it'll have longer folds. And the more fat in an area, the deeper the folds will get, creating deeper, wider shadows. The folds on the inside of the phalanges will also respond to the fact that the skin closer to the joints gets tighter and closer to the bones, meaning the folds will go in around them, as opposed to the outside of the phalanges, which crinkle in together like jeggings fabric. I have no better word to call this next detail type than lumps. Please forgive me. Lumps are all of the bumps and outer bends that happen in response to muscles, sesamoid bones, and fat distribution. Probably the biggest lump will happen here by the thumb metacarpal, where a ton of the hand muscles will sit, as shown in this image from the last video. We'll also see lumps at the joints in the palm that connect the metacarpals to the phalanges. We'll also see lumps where the joints connect in particularly bony bones, especially ones with those sesamoid bones. So, to recap before we move forward, we've boxed out the bones to plan for the movement of the hands based on their limitations. We've blocked out the shapes in response to those motions and given ourselves a plan for the detail. Then we added in the details, completing our basic sketch. Now from here, there are a lot of different routes you can take with these drawings. We'll go through a few, but let's start with line art. Line art is an incredibly versatile skill, and there are at minimum thousands of styles we could go over, but for now, let's just focus on 3 general ones. An oversimplified one, a basic one, and a highly detailed one. Let's start with a highly detailed one and talk about what we can take away as we go, since it can honestly be a lot harder to know what to simplify than it is to know how to add in those extra details. So, with a highly detailed line work, we'll want a thinner outline with line weight to depict shadow and weight. We'll add in several folds wherever they belong and add thicker line weights wherever they'd be the darkest. We'll define some of the details of the texture of the skin. A quick note here, your skin textures will typically be more defined in a line art like this when they're closest to the shadows, as the textures themselves will cast more shadow in that area as well. And then let's add some shading. We can do this both with thickening the line weight or even filling in the full shadow to make it into a line itself, and with hatching, which has multiple types and will be something we go over in our line art video on a later date. But for now, we'll go with this one because, well, I like it best here. We don't want to add in every tiny little detail, as too much can still be overwhelming and problematic. But we do want to add enough to make this hand look real without adding shading or color. This line art is generally meant to be the star of the show, with color, if any, as an accent. Because we're trying to find that balance, we won't do much with the more lit areas, but will do more wherever the object might have a bit more shading. Next, let's change this into a more basic line work. First, let's erase the hatching, as a basic line art will have a minimal amount of that. After that, we can actually leave the detail in the lines and shadow, but remove a majority of the textures of the skin. I leave about this much of it, but you can adjust as much as you'd like to fit your style. After that, we will add in just a little more line weight in order to depict a lot of the extra details that we just took away. This type of line style is great for comic art, as it will lend itself to letting the coloring pop while still giving that line art feel and having some good detail to it itself. It will still look great on its own, but in my opinion, this one looks best with coloring that really pushes the light and shadow with it. And lastly, we'll talk about oversimplified lines. These lines generally look best when your line weight is less noticeable, so let's make the outer line thicker everywhere with only a subtle change between the areas. Next, we can remove most of our detail lines. And a lot of our bends and folds can be represented with just one line that's thicker than the ones in place now. Oversimplified styles can have whole parts of an object removed or blended together if having them there doesn't change the overall look. That's why you often see 3 and 4 finger hands on these styles rather than a full 5. We'll stick to 5 for now, but just keep in mind what you remove is entirely dependent on what you decide is important to the visual storytelling of the image. This goes the same for adjusted proportions within the image, but we can go over those kinds of changes in a cartooning and styles tutorial I have in mind for the future. Oversimplified line art is meant to make the style itself pop, so whether we color it or not, we want to make it uniquely ours. Unless, of course, we're imitating another person's style, then we want to make it uniquely theirs. Your colors will usually be simplified as well, often with a simple cell shading, if shaded at all. But sketches and line art are not the only way to represent a hand. We can also show them by drawing them like a sculptor. What does this mean? Sculptors create their art by building up shapes or chipping down to them, then adding in details by manipulating light and shadow around the smaller details of an object. One of the best examples of this is with sculpted eyes, where often the pupil itself will be sculpted inward to remove light rather than outward, which is how it would actually sit. Painting like a sculptor means that you're starting with the big shapes like we did with the sketch, adding in your light and shadow, and then carving the details out little by little with that light and shadow. If you haven't already, this would be a great time to check out my video on understanding light and shadow, which discusses how to decide the way light would fall onto an object, as well as what types of light create what types of shadow. But if you'd like to wait on that, I'll give you some of the cliff notes for now. If our light is here, it'll hit this hand here, creating light that bounces here and here. If you're unsure how that light would bounce, remember that you can draw the object in the light's perspective like this to see what it would see. Anything that it can see would be lit on the other angle. So, keeping in mind shadow on each of these examples, and adding in light as well, This is what a black and white hand would look like after removing the sketch without the use of line art. So that should be everything that I missed on the last video. As the other one, which I will once again put on the screen, discusses how to render, what kinds of colors to use, and all the extra details of a hand, which means it's time to showcase our coloring page for this video. I've already added a basic line art to this one, so for our render today, instead of coloring it, I'll go hard into painting it like a sculptor. First, we'll define where our lumps, bumps, webbing, and folds will sit by blocking out some of the shapes and surrounding them. We'll also manage the cartoon hands with cell shading, since I think that it will juxtapose against the more detailed hands better. Next, we'll define some of the specific folds and textures created by the aforementioned details. After that, we'll do a quick pass on all of the shadow, and then on the lighting. We'll do a deeper shadow to define the deepest parts of the folds and other such details. We'll add in some highlights to define where the skin is stretched most, including on the webbing. And then we'll give it one last detail and textures pass just to make sure it's as rendered as I can get it. Thanks for joining me on this tutorial and sticking with me until the end. I hope it helps. Remember, if you color this one, to post your results and tag me at ArcherKPaintAlong. And if you like the idea of me splitting complicated topics into multiple videos in the future, especially if I actually plan it out on purpose next time, let me know. If you have any questions about anything in the video or have any suggestions for future paint-alongs, please let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, please hit me with that like button and consider subscribing for more tips and tricks on art improvement, as well as art memes, tutorials, and other artistic support. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!